Hi, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to the Postmodern Realities podcast, brought to you by the Christian Research Institute and the Christian Research Journal. I'm Melanie Cogdill, managing editor of the Christian Research Journal. It's November 2025, and this is episode 469, which is a conversation about the best-selling author and historian Yuval Noah Harari. On this episode, I'm joined by Jay Watts, who is the founder and president of Merely Human Ministries, Inc., an organization founded to equip Christians and pro-life advocates to defend the intrinsic dignity of all human life. Jay has written an online exclusive feature article for the Christian Research Journal. His article is called The Incredulity of Yuval Noah Harari, Evaluating the World's Foremost Big Story Historian, which you can read for free at equip.org. That's EQUIP.org. Jay, it's great to have you back on the podcast.
It's always great to be here.
Well, normally we cover issues for Jay adjacent with just human dignity and human life, but Jay is also an apologist. And last year I was reading a book by a best-selling author that I talked about in my intro that we're going to be covering today, Yuval Harari. And I thought, I think just an apologist can cover this because he makes a lot of very fascinating and very grandiose claims about religion. So before we get into the actual review of his book, Nexus, which is the book that I read, I want to ask you a little bit about the author. So could you briefly introduce Yuval Noah Harari? Who is he? What is his academic specialty? And what kind of subjects does he typically explore in both his writing and his public speaking? He gives a lot of interviews on podcasts, for example.
Yes, he was originally a historian at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and his focus was on medieval and early modern warfare. And he wrote a book called Sapiens, which launched him into the public as a public intellectual. I mean, just a massive way. I mean, we're talking about 23 million copies of that book sold. He became the darling of people like Barack Obama, Mark Zuckerberg, Bill Gates. These influencers, these powerful people just loved him and platformed him and brought him in for interviews. The subject matter that he talks about in Sapiens is basically the entire history of humanity and how, in his mind, the story that he tells. And this is interesting to me because Yuval Noah Harari, in all of his interviews and his writings, he emphasizes the power of stories and storytelling. And this is his real gift. He is a genuinely gifted storyteller. And the story that he weaves is of this one human among many humans, multiple different humans living at that different time, at the outset of Homo sapiens, and then goes through some steps of evolution or sorts of events that happen that just catapult human beings from being one of many humans to the extinction of these other humans and the acquisition of the abilities, like for say the ability to become Homo sapiens is the ability to have conscious awareness and the cognitive revolution, right? He suddenly has the ability to think critically, to create. And the biggest thing that he does at this point is that he says that we create fictions, that we're able to believe in and act on things that aren't real. And fictions that he defines as religion would be one of those. In his mind, one of the most powerful organizing forces in human history is religion. That it makes it possible now for small hunter-gatherer groups to become bigger groups, to get beyond their families, to start to have a common myth that binds them, to create culture, and all of this is born out of this progressive moments of invention throughout human history that ultimately ends with us being the dominant species on Earth. Even though relatively small as far as the numbers that we hold compared to other animals. The population size is relatively small. Because of this movement through these different progressions, we went from being one of many humans to the dominant species on Earth, and in a very short time, because of our creative ability, on the verge of destroying ourselves or losing ourselves in technology in some way or another. So it's this grand story that he tells that just fascinated and captivated the world. And so because of that, and we both work with academics and around a lot of academics, and the academic study is an incredibly specialized thing. And when you get a PhD, you basically become an expert on one thing. I remember the first time a PhD explained this to me when I was younger. They said PhD doesn't mean that you're this all around brilliant person. It means that you know more about one tiny little thing than anybody else on earth. That's what you were trying to do to become a PhD. But he becomes this oracle, this prophet, this person who knows everything. And so when you're asked about what he's invited to speak on, it's crazy. It's like the entire scope of human history is open to him as far as the subject matters that he's allowed to talk about. And increasingly, since his book Homo Deus and then now Nexus thereafter, which has an emphasis on technology as being a risk, a doomsday risk for humanity, he's asked to talk about the future and technology and AI and things like that. He's kind of become this sort of recognized authority on AI, even though that, again, is not his specialty. Self-admittedly in Nexus, he says, this just isn't what I do for a living, but it has consumed my life.
It is really fascinating because you think about Nexus as a book about the influence of technology and artificial intelligence, and you would think, well, he has a background in technology, and I read his bio and go, oh, this is the Sapiens author who is a historian. So you were mentioning that he has become the darling even of the tech set, or just kind of influencers. When his new book came out, I heard an in-depth interview with him on the Trevor Noah podcast, and so I was kind of intrigued by this new book that he had. So he is very popular, as you noted, from his book sales worldwide with just, the general public, a lay audience. But he started out, as you noted, in academia. So is his work also popular with academic colleagues who are saying it's great that he's reached kind of the masses?
Oh no, he is not. He is. The working through the volumes of criticisms of his work is more intense than working through his own volumes of writing, which is in itself a task. I mean, and I'd like to be upfront. Studying him for months, which I've done now, months of reading what he's written and then reading what other people have written about him. This is a monumental task to sort through this guy and his belief on things, and then to sort through the criticism, because it goes beyond just articles, which there have been numerous articles. One particular one that's lovely, if you want to read on the shorter side of criticism, or two of them. One was written by Darshana Narayanan for Current Affairs, and she has an article where she dissects a lot of his misunderstanding in genetic science and linguistics, and these are not small mistakes. She says, look, this is somebody who doesn't understand the science that he's talking about, and unfortunately the science is a major part of the work that he's offered. And they go from small mistakes at one point where he characterizes, I think, chimpanzees standing shoulder to shoulder fighting. And in order to compare them to human beings, he sets them as they're standing back to back, shoulder to shoulder, to fight against cheetahs. And, a critic stepped in, and one of the scholars who looked at that said, yeah, that's great, except for there are no cheetahs and chimpanzees living together anywhere in the world. Now, he probably mistook cheetahs for leopards, and that may be a small error, but as Darshana Narayanan says, his work is filled with small and large errors. He gets all sorts of things. He gets linguistics completely wrong. He talks about the language of animals, when it is commonly shared across linguists that language, as it's properly understood academically, is a thing that is incredibly complex and only humans have. Now, vocalization that communicates information, that happens in the animal world all the time. Language, when we're talking about symbolic writing and words that evoke abstract concepts, well, that would fall back into that sort of cognitive revolution that he was talking about that separated human beings from the rest of humanity. So, it's highly critical. There's an anthropologist named C.R. Hallpike that wrote an article highly critical of his work and how he doesn't understand anthropology. A guy by the name of Mauricio Meglioli, who is an Argentinian scholar, wrote an entire book called The Unbelievable Story of Sapiens, originally wrote it in Spanish, and he translated it himself into English so he could share it with the world. It's a sort of detective story about how this book, Sapiens, that is so wrong about so much stuff, became so popular because it just dumbfounds him that this is a thing that he has to contend with. And he writes in there, and some of the criticism, let's give a couple, other than the factual errors that he makes. One of the most often cited criticisms is he doesn't cite people. He doesn't attribute his ideas to anyone. As a matter of fact, the first chapter of Sapiens, which covers a monstrous amount of human history, has one single endnote in it. A single endnote for that whole chapter. Only one time does he cite anybody as he covers this vast scope of human history. And that this is a continued problem that he has. He just is out there saying things without any attribution, without anybody getting credit for the things he said. The problem they say with that is that he has, and Meglioli writes it himself, admitted, there's nothing new in Sapiens. There is no original or unpublished research among his sources. He is passing on the work of other people, but he's not crediting those other people. And even to go so far as the person who was responsible, Stephen Gunn, who oversaw his dissertation at Oxford, wrote that Harari seems to have constructed a focus and a method built to avoid criticism. By taking on impossibly large scopes, he shields himself from the nitpicking that comes with making specific claims in specific fields. And finally, I think this is the funniest thing, given some of the things we'll talk about later about Harari. For years, it was reported that he had attended a conference of historians, in his field. We all do this. We go to conferences with people who are our colleagues who work in our area. He had gone to this for years. After Sapiens was published and became a massive hit, he went back to the conference expecting to be welcomed as a hero, right? That they, as you mentioned, they were going to be so excited about their work getting this kind of critical, being beloved by the public that way. And the response was so critical, he left the conference and has never gone back. So, no, I would say far from being embraced by the academic community, there are several questions about his methods and how he operates that they find, they just find the whole process objectionable. I think I quoted in the article a great quote, I think, from G.K. Chesterton from Eugenics and Other Evils, where he says, it's impossible to be an expert. It's impossible to be an expert on the universe, right? It's impossible to have specialty, to specialize in all of human history. Specialization and the general scope of human history work against each other. And he admits himself, Harari says, his scope is huge and he expects there to be small mistakes. It's just as critics say, they're not small mistakes. You're saying things that other people have said for years without attribution. And every time you break out and try to say something original, it seems to be filled with error.
We are soon coming up on almost 50 years of publishing the Christian Research Journal. And it's been 2.5 years since we transitioned to becoming an exclusive online publication. And we've made this publication completely free without a paywall, which in today's publications, whether it's magazines or favorite websites or favorite newspapers that are online, you need a subscription, a paid subscription, or some kind of paid monthly fee to be able to access all of their content. We don't require that at all. So we are asking you to partner with us by giving us a tip that really would help us out, because we have not decreased the amount of content that we bring to you every year. We did not close down our magazine. We just changed its delivery. And so many of you have been faithful over the years to partner with us by subscribing to the print Christian Research Journal. So we hope that you have continued to enjoy the podcasts and also the new content that comes out every week. We have 52 articles a year and sometimes even more with additional bonus content. So we just ask that you think about giving us a tip for all of our content. It wouldn't be as much as a subscription. If you think about giving up maybe a coffee that you enjoy a couple of times a week, or maybe even putting a monthly streaming service subscription on hold for 1 month. We would appreciate your gift to us, and you can do that by going to equip.org, clicking Journal, clicking Postmodern Realities Podcast, and you can see every single one of our 469 episodes. And if you click there, you will find a link to which you can go to. If you scroll down, you will see that you can give us a tip. And we are so very grateful for that. And now back to my conversation with Jay Watts about Yuval Noah Harari. Well, we noted already that he is a best-selling author. So can you talk about his 4 major books? So Yuval Noah Harari has famously written Sapiens, but he's also written Homo Deus, 21 Lessons for the 21st Century, and Unstoppable Us. And then later on, we'll talk about his newest, Nexus. But those 4 major books, how do they differ from one another?
Well, the first and most important evaluation as far as Yuval Noah Harari's impact on the world is that each one of them sells a lot, but sells less than the one that preceded it. So Homo Deus was a huge hit, but it sold fewer copies, far fewer copies than Sapiens, which was just a monster worldwide hit, and still is, still selling. 21 Lessons from the 21st Century sold much lower than that. Unstoppable Us is a children's book. I mean, it is written for children. So Homo Deus, what happens, and I saw one critic talk about this, that it was inescapable that he was going to have to get a little, to narrow his focus a little bit. So what Homo Deus does is it starts to narrow the focus a little bit. And this person says they think that the world gets less enchanted with him the more specific he gets. Now, he still talks in this grand story, this whole scope of human history, but he's going to a very specific end. In Homo Deus, he's talking about how we became human gods from human sapiens, going to be through this merger with us and our technology, either voluntarily or involuntarily, that we will ultimately merge with technology. And he believes and raises at that point the specter that he doesn't believe human beings will be around in 100 to 200 years at all. That Homo sapiens will have been this odd creature that came into existence, had this very fast rocket rise to the top, and then ceased to exist. He has very specific fears also in Homo Deus that technology and AI, and Nexus as well, but he has in all of his general talkings about AI, that we run the risk of wiping consciousness out of the universe altogether as well. But here's an interesting move forward in Homo Deus. And Lessons from the 21st Century is actually 21 Lessons from the 21st Century, I've understood, is actually comes from his lectures. So it's where he's translating his lectures into a book. You get the more specific comments about different things. And then I said it's Unstoppable Us. It's him taking the idea of this powerful animal on Earth and all the things we're capable of doing and translating it into a book for kids, has illustrations. It talks about things in a much more positive light, by the way, whereas Homo Deus and Nexus are become more grim, and the prophet starts to see the end of humanity, a sort of apocalyptic prediction that he starts to get about how we aren't going to last more than the next 100 or 200 years. Unstoppable Us, written for children, is a much more positive approach to it. It's talking to them about how we were capable of overcoming all these things in the past. And so now, with the advances that we have available to us, we're going to be capable of overcoming the challenges that we have as long as we direct our energies in positive ways.
Well, there's 2 things that I would like to cover before we talk about Nexus in particular, because I think that it is very much needed, because it's kind of setting the foundation for how he approaches this particular topic in this book. And, like he said, he lectures on this vast swath of things. I actually looked at one of the speaker bureaus that he works for, and it kind of says that I can talk about all of human history, technology. I can talk about the universe,
I'm an
So
expert on everything.
it kind of was, but one of those things was, technology. So he has an interest. Yuval Noah Harari has an interest, obviously, in artificial intelligence, because he writes about it in Nexus, and technology. And he just mentioned that he just doesn't think we'll be around in a couple hundred years. Is it a clear belief about a reason for thinking that, about where humanity's headed? Does he see anything as hopeful, or does he see everything as doomed?
I don't even know if he would understand it in terms of it's so difficult. And we he is hard to get a hold of sometimes because he says so many things, and oftentimes he says contradictory things. Even within a couple of pages of what he'll say something, and a couple of pages later, he'll completely undermine it. I mentioned an example of that in the article I wrote. But I think because he has a sort of Richard Dawkins, you can see the effect on him or the influence on some of his approach. If you read Ancestor's Tale by Richard Dawkins, you see that Richard Dawkins, one of the famous new atheists from back when 20 years ago when that was a big thing, he had written that it's wrong to think of human beings as a substantive thing. Like somebody who believes in sort of Aristotelian categories or Thomistic categories will see human beings as something, that we are a thing in and of itself, a substance. Dawkins says it's wrong to think in those terms. All life on earth is transitional by nature. We're not a finished product. There is no end product. We're all transitioning from one thing to another. And I think that's why the categories of good and bad wouldn't really always apply to the way he is evaluating things. I think he would see, if you were able to, and we'll talk about this a lot with Nexus, but if transitioning out of being a Homo sapiens into Homo Deus, or transitioning into this world merged with our technology, means that we have better information, that we're able to address the needs or desires of society, whatever society looks like at that point, in a more efficient way, then I don't think he would mourn the loss of Homo sapiens at all. I think he probably was surprised somewhat. We talked about Nexus being another talk about AI. He admits at the beginning of Nexus that this was born out of Homo Deus, that he wrote Homo Deus, and then the people who love him so much gave him access to all of these different areas and shared with them the research that was going on, so that he would have the information capable to write this next area of concern that he has in Nexus. But I think he 100% seems to believe that human beings will not exist within a century or two. It's just Homo sapiens are going to be gone. That is a certainty in his mind, as much as he's ever capable of making certain statements. But I don't think he sees that as bad.
That is just very interesting. Before we go on further, you were talking about, Homo sapiens and Homo Deus. What is he saying about what Homo Deus is?
That would be, Homo Deus is, the human God, right? Homo sapiens is the wise human, the wise man. That's when we were able to break away from all of the other humans that existed, Neanderthal and all that, and become this new thing. Now he's saying Homo Deus we would transcend. You see this sort of stuff, and we were talking about transhumanism and posthumanism philosophy, which again he seems to track with, and this mixed, muddled view of humanity he has. It's really difficult to fully understand what he believes we are because he never gives a clear definition. I don't think he's even interested in the question, to be honest with you. But Homo Deus and transhumanism and posthumanism, that philosophy, that idea that we will transcend, we can force the next evolutionary step. Every single being who has ever existed on Earth had to wait for the pressures of their environment to make slow changes through mutation to become the next thing under neo-Darwinian understanding of evolution. So the post-humanist and transhumanist philosophy that we're talking about, that he's kind of ascribing to with Homo Deus, is this idea that we, for the first time, are a being who can force the next step in evolution, not by waiting for mutations to happen that change us, but by changing our genetic code if we want to, by rewriting it, or by merging ourselves, which is much more likely with the technology that we have, to transcend the limitations of humanity, both information and time-wise, and to become something entirely new. Homo God. Man God.
Very interesting. And that kind of, segues into my next question, because I would like you to talk about Yuval Noah Harari's view of religion. So how does religion, and that would be all religions as I read it in Nexus, how does that kind of factor into his exploration of history and technology?
He thinks all religion is fiction, but he thinks all nations are fiction, all corporations are fictions. He basically thinks money is fiction. Everything is fiction. He has a very philosophical positivist view of the world, in the sense that the only thing that's real, and these material realities that we can test and observe and touch and experience in that way, and that everything else would fall into the category of fiction. That in and of itself is not a negative for him, because he would say the advancement of humanity these fictions made that possible. The ability to believe in religions and gods and nations and money and all of these things, it made it possible for us to advance the way that we did. His view of religion is negative beyond that, in that he sees it as let's say like a vestigial organ or something left over that's no longer necessary. He blames it for many social ills. Obviously, he has strong feelings about Christianity and Islam's condemnation of homosexuality. Being a gay man, a married gay man himself, living in Tel Aviv with his husband, and he sees the introduction of that, what he would consider to be homophobic teaching, into human history, misogynistic introduction into human history. He talks about those things as being negative. He also sees the problem with it, since it's not true. The best thing that you can get is the best version of the fiction. And he says the best versions of it, and what we would mean by best versions of it would be the more altruistic, loving aspects of it. They can get lost in the sort of judgmental or supernatural aspects of it. And so that leaves the believer open to manipulation that can be dangerous and destructive to societies or to certain sectors of societies. And so his overall view of religion is negative, in the sense that he thinks it was a powerful motivating factor, but the money now transcends it as a powerful motivating factor. And as a result, religion is not only not necessary, but ultimately destructive now, because of the negative elements that it brings into society.
So obviously, you made the point that he thinks religion is a myth, but is he completely hostile towards all religion? I mean, you did mention he feels that it kind of created certain things that were bad, like, patriarchy and misogyny and anti, gay sentiment and so forth. Does he have specific criticisms of Christianity? I did find in his book, because his background is in medieval history, that the examples that he gave were these just really incredibly graphic, horrific examples from medieval history of how the church saw certain people who didn't agree with them as witches, and they tortured them even like toddlers, and that kind of thing. But so does he see everything as bad in religion? And what does he specifically say about Christianity?
I think, in let's put it this way. He gave 4 paragraphs to the rise of monotheism and Sapiens, and he gave multiple pages. So the rise of monotheism and Christianity get 4 paragraphs in the book Sapiens as far as an explanation. He could not have been less interested in that, even though you're talking about when you're talking about the rise of monotheism, Judaism, Christianity, some of the most influential things that have ever happened in human history. He just doesn't have the slightest interest in that as an evaluation. But he gives multiple pages to Heinrich Kramer's book, The Hammer of Witches and Nexus, the book that was published in 1485, widely disseminated. Now, this is nasty. It's horrible. It convinced multiple communities all throughout Europe that there were witches and demon-possessed witches living among them who were looking to murder them and to do all sorts of disgusting sexual mutilations to them and things of that nature. And as a result of this spurned and told them how to find them and to kill them. And as a result of this, some 40 to 50,000 innocent people were slaughtered in the following decades, until they finally got over this fervor. What's interesting, he does admit in there that there were Christian forces that knew this was nonsense and were trying to work against it. But the problem was, you didn't have the mass communication ability that you have today. And so as this book spread, as it could because of the advance of the printing press, and this fever of hatred and paranoia spread, and they started doing terrible things, believing they were serving God, the ability to stop it just didn't exist as it might exist today. Why I say that's interesting, because then he talks about the Inquisition right after that as well. You asked if he had a negative view of Christianity. Well, this is what he talks about when he talks about Christianity. He talks about the witch hunts that started in 1485. He talks about the Inquisition. He talks about the idea that we chose First Timothy for the Bible instead of the Acts of Paul and Thecla. And that would have, if we had put Paul and Thecla in there and not First Timothy, then we wouldn't have had the homophobic, misogynistic current running through Christianity for 2,000 years. And because of the curating of the Bible, we chose that book over the others. So it's all negative, right? So it's impossible to say, even though he has this sort of functional love of it, yeah, it works and it got us here because it unified us. The only thing he's willing to discuss about Christian history, not the foundation, not the resurrection, not the universities, not the hospitals, not the way that we transform the understanding of the weak, not the ways that Tom Holland talks about in Dominion in his book as a non-Christian, writing about how Christianity changed the world, or not in the ways that it was written in the Genesis of Science, where James Hannam, another non-believer, talks about how Christianity played a role in creating modern science. He talks about none of those things. All he talks about is these incredibly negative things, poisonous attributes. And I would say, look, as far as we know, the Heinrich Kramer's book, The Hammer of Witches, and everything that happened during that period was obviously deeply evil. It also worked contrary to what we were taught as Christians. And prior to that moment, nobody cared about witches. It was something that just happened that was crazy. And to take that as representative of how Christianity affects the world, and to ignore all of the mountains of evidence of the positive things that Christianity has done for the world is evidence of a nasty, nasty predisposition to dislike Christianity.
Well, I want to turn now to Nexus. I mean, I think this background is very helpful because it will just shed some light, I think, for our listeners if they choose to read this book as to like how, okay, now we're starting at Nexus. It's his next big work. It came out a year ago in 2024. And how does everything that went before inform it? And then he gives some like new, not new, but maybe he hadn't talked to that depth about technology and so forth. But one of the biggest things that he talks about is how societies can be good. And it has to do with these things that he calls self-correcting systems and mechanisms. And I just really want to quote exactly from his writing, because I agree with you. As I was reading it, it'd be like he would make these statements, and then a couple chapters later, I'd be like, wait, you're just saying the exact opposite of what you just said a couple chapters ago, and especially it had to do with these self-correcting systems. So in the prologue of Nexus, the full title of that book is called Nexus, A Brief History of Information Systems from the Stone Age to AI. He writes this, quote, "Given enough information and enough time, we are capable of correcting even our gravest mistakes." So what does he mean by that? Like he focuses on these self-correcting systems. He believes that's one of the theses of this particular book, that it can correct all societal ills.
Yes. And once you get past the fictions that have served us but are no longer necessary, yes, he believes, and he has a reductive view of human beings. And so what I mean by that is, as we've already talked about, he has a very material understanding of the world. In Homo Deus, he talks quite a bit about being a determinist, and that we're not, obviously he doesn't believe in things like the soul, the spirit, or the mind even, really, in any way. So he has this reductive view of human beings. So good information can be used to satisfy the basic needs of human society and eliminate social ills. If we can get, so there's the self-correcting mechanisms and there's the infallibility of information. So we have to be able to have a source of information that we understand is infallible, or that we can trust the information that we're getting as best representing something good. True would be a weird thing to say for him because he doesn't seem to have a good concept of that. So good information. And if you have good information, then it can be used to satisfy the basic needs of the biological society that we are and eliminate social ills. If we reprogram ourselves to share resources, understanding our place in reality, stop being nationalistic, and open up ourselves, he seems to want this sort of democratic imperialism, or this larger scale thing where you can merge the good of both of those things, so that they're serving reality, right? So that we know that the real needs, the functional needs that people have, are being met. And if we can get there, then yes, we can solve everything. And there's being him, and being sort of all over the place. When he's asked for details on this in interviews and in his writing, he has a particular type of Buddhist meditation that he follows 2 hours a day and goes on a retreat for 2 weeks, I think, a year, and just meditates. He's very By the way, I agree with this sentiment of what he's about to say. He is very cautious about his interaction with technology. For somebody who writes about it, he doesn't want to be around it very much. He is honest when somebody says, so you don't carry a cell phone, and they give him credit for that. He says, yeah, but I do have a team of people who have cell phones, and they're basically working for me. So I do have a cell phone. It's just someone else is carrying it for me. But he tries to control his relationship with technology, which I think is an admirable thing. But his answers oftentimes, I mean, literally in a conversation about peace in Palestine, somehow the idea of how do we solve the problem between Israel and Palestine, the answer of, well, meditation does come into it. Okay. And that's for me, a very dissatisfying answer for somebody who has such a reductive view of human beings, who believes in this idea that just enough information can take care of the basic needs of the animal that we are. And if those basic needs are met, we'll be satisfied. Not necessarily happy, but flourish.
You mentioned just a minute ago that he probably doesn't have a clear definition of truth. And I would say that's something that he talks about over and over again. Like he'll say the word truth, distinguishing between truth and myths. Myths for him, as I see it, are like certain political viewpoints he doesn't agree with, and then also, religion. But he also, I just quoted saying that he's saying that given enough information, enough time, we're capable of correcting our gravest mistakes. And yet he thinks that the quality of the information that we have has not improved. So, why does he think that the rise of, our sophisticated societies with AI and so forth are just as susceptible as the, Stone Age tribes to, a lot of times he talks about this in Nexus, mass delusion, manipulation, and the rise of destructive ideologies, which are not true, but he never really defines what is true.
Yeah, and going back, I didn't fully answer your question last time, so this goes together, so I can get that back to your question about self-correcting mechanisms. That's That's where he would say the problem is that self-correcting mechanisms, and he would point to science for this, right? He would say, for science, we have self-correcting mechanisms, meaning that it corrects itself, that it works in an effort to find the real thing. So if it knows that there's something wrong in science, if we find a belief is wrong, we abandon the belief and we embrace the new belief, and we're forward looking. And so the mechanisms that have existed that he would say up to this point have not been self-corrective mechanisms, or the information has been too fallible. There has not been a source of infallible information. And because we are still holding on to things like nationalistic ideals, religious beliefs, these ideas that are information, they count as information. They don't count as truth. They count as myth or false or fictions. But that information is still being acted on and working on. And so the reason that we're still not good at it is that we haven't developed either an infallible method of getting information that we can trust as reasonably true. And the other side of that is that the systems of information that they're working on are not necessarily self-correcting in the way that they need to be. And so in order to, it's going to take, in his mind, a reprogramming, a re-understanding. Going back to that question I saw him asked about the war between Gaza and basically between Hamas and Israel, and in that war that was being fought, so is there any way for there to be peace? And he goes back to this idea: yes, if the Israelis can reprogram themselves to change the way they understand who the Gazans are, who Hamas is, and if Hamas and the Gazans can change the way that they understand who Israel is, because he'll say, in reality, not thinking of borders, not thinking of religions, nothing else, in reality, this is not a war for land or resources. There's plenty of land and resources for both of them to live. The problem is these fictions that they believe about themselves that are clashing with each other and causing all of this problem. So he would say the reason we have not progressed or gotten better is because we haven't abandoned bad information systems for good information systems. We're still operating on information systems that have a bad track record in infallibility and have a bad track record as far as being corrective. Where science itself, if we could just get to trusting the scientific method, which, by the way, this is him if he gives the worst possible view of Christianity through the things that he shares, he gives the rosiest possible view of science and how self-correcting they are and how honest they are about different aspects of scientific advancement. But that's another conversation. But that would be why he would say we're still stuck. We have bad information systems still lingering.
Well, kind of like you were saying, that goes to that particular conversation maybe he was having about the war, anything else, really, any kind of challenge that he sees in society. In chapter 4 of Nexus, and the name of that chapter is called Errors, the Fantasy of Infallibility. Just that title is fascinating. He writes this, quote, networks that claim divine authority often resist correction, even when evidence mounts against their claims. So the thing is, well, you have to understand another point of view, but there are all these networks that resist correction, aka the church/religion. So why does he specifically, I mean, he's talking about religion, but he always will point to Christianity, and to him that's everything, whether it's Roman Catholicism or Protestantism, particularly I think Roman Catholicism, because his background in medieval history and political views of the church back then probably play into it. But he posits that religion itself resists correction, and so therefore that's an issue, and it can't have these self-correcting mechanisms.
Yeah, and I would say probably the reason he focuses on Roman Catholicism as well is because he does place a lot of importance on the size, and since most Christians who self-identify as Christians identify as Roman Catholics worldwide, he would see the Roman Catholic part of Christianity as being the most powerful. He, as a person who grew up in Israel and lives in Tel Aviv, he doesn't believe that Judaism is even of any historical significance. He thinks it's not even one of the major religions. He gives that to uh, uh, Islam, Christianity, and Hinduism because they have the most adherents and the most people following them. So going back to the question, why does he think or posit the Christian church resists correction? It's because, in his view, Christianity looks backwards to answer questions. So looking at a church council, if there was something that happened, what they would do is look backwards and from the Bible try to determine what the truth was and to make whatever's happening today marry what happened yesterday in the past. That's his understanding of what church councils did. That's his understanding of how the church operates in the world. He sees it as constantly either reinterpreting the text that already exists or reinterpreting the present to fit a narrative that was written in the text in the past. He compares this, by the way, to the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, particularly in the ability of the DSM to revise itself based on new evidence. Like and he points out the removal of homosexuality. This is in 1952. Homosexuality was in the DSM as a sociopathic personality disorder. After 1974, the DSM changed its view on homosexuality. Originally voted for in 1973 and did all the investigation in 1974 is ratified. So the DSM changed its view on homosexuality. It still, by the way, kept it as a source of distress for people that were feeling it. And then that it was ultimately, I think, 1978 removed altogether. But he says, look, he says, see, the DSM is science. If the DSM finds a new truth, something that's new, that's verifiable, it will just drop what it used to believe and act like it wasn't there at all. Whereas the Bible will not stop saying the wrong things that it says, and they'll just try to reinterpret it because the language is unassailable. The language cannot be changed. And so for him, that's the way he understands the Christian relationship with the world. It's always reverse thinking, always backward thinking. Again, he sees nothing about how Christianity positively impacted the world by looking forward to systems that were corrupt based on the way they treated or understood what human beings were, and to be able to see something better that would make the world better if you applied a better view of human beings. So Christianity was able to apply the teachings of the Bible to the world as it existed and forward think into new societies, new orders, new ways of governing, all of these things. And he can't see that. All he can see is that structurally he sees it as backward looking instead of forward thinking. By the way, as an aside, again, going back to the same criticism I leveled earlier, that's an incredibly naive way of understanding how the DSM works, as if the DSM never has any political pressure put on it. I mean, there are things that happen within the DSM that happen as a result of politics. It has nothing to do with the changing of the scientific understanding of disorders. It has to do with political pressure that's been put on it by certain groups to remove certain things, change certain things. But that there is his comparison, the church and the Bible versus the DSM.
So, to build on that, he says this in chapter 6. For centuries, Christian authorities punished those who questioned doctrine because not because they feared error, but because they feared disruption. So, kind of like what you're saying backwards, why does Harari think that the church is power hungry for control versus caring about theological truth? It's kind of interesting to me that as a historian, usually people in the humanities, even if they don't agree with a specific point of view, they have the ability to even intellectually understand a different point of view, which I kind of don't know that he does when it comes to religion, perhaps.
Oh yeah, I don't. And Meglioli, who I've mentioned a couple of times, wrote a book, and other people as well. But he specifically criticizes him for wiping out entire disciplines. I mean, in his pursuit of sharing his story, which has been a wildly successful story for him and has elevated him to the position as elevated to him. It was necessary for him to get rid of theology. It was necessary for him to get rid of art. It was necessary for him to get, I mean, he had to just eliminate entire understandings in human areas of study. Philosophy, he calls himself a philosopher on his website. As far as I can tell, he never interacts with any philosophical claims on any subject matter, but specifically as he dismisses religion. So this idea that one thing I would say too that feeds into this is that his view of humanity is very impoverished, right? I mean, and I talked about how he doesn't interact with philosophical arguments. I mean, there are philosophical arguments in defense of the truth of theism and Christianity, and a lot of those arguments are constructed in such a way as they come in syllogistic reasoning, and you're building a cumulative case for Christianity. And the idea of any of these arguments, like the cosmological argument, like the ontological argument, the moral argument for the existence of God, all of these, you're making arguments where the basis of them is that the best explanation for the world as we experience it requires a God. And the best explanation for the history as we have seen it requires a resurrection of Jesus to explain the things that we've seen happen. And these are arguments that are crafted in order to be able to say there are elements of the universe that cannot be explained as well without God as they are with God. Well, he doesn't interact with anything like that. He assumes from the beginning his view of what humanity is, whatever it is. He never gives us a clear understanding of what he thinks it is true. And then from that, he makes all of his other deductions. And so that's called begging the question. I know largely nowadays that term has been lost to the world because they think begging the question means raising the question. It originally was a philosophical term. Begging the question meant that you assume that which you had a responsibility to argue for in your position. He has a responsibility to argue for his anthropology of human beings. He has a responsibility to argue for this concept of religion not being real. He does none of it. He assumes he's right. And he goes forward with this philosophical positivist view that only material things matter. He seems to rob from Dawkins, and he approaches Christianity and religious beliefs and all beliefs and things that he doesn't agree with, all things that don't fall into his narrative as far as how he understands what the world is, like Richard Dawkins' meme theory, which says that some ideas are like viruses, which attach themselves to the mind, and they demonstrate a survivability, like a Darwinian survivability through generations and cultures. Religious beliefs, nationalist beliefs, monetary systems, all of them are fictional notions, but they organize life effectively. But he's a determinist. And then sometimes he sounds like Nietzsche. So in Homo Deus, he argues for determinism, which means that you don't have free will. He argues against individualism, meaning that you're not an individual entity. You're not a person. You're a part of a society. And even your person is sort of broken up into what he calls a individualist concept of humanity. He sounds like Nietzsche sometimes, where he talks about human contentment is tied up into the accumulation of power, and dissatisfaction is in the loss of power. So information is serving this concept of expanding power and not discovering truth, whatever that is. And one of the things, and I think I mentioned this earlier when you and I were talking before we started recording, Meglioli, at the end of his book says, with everything that has been discussed so far in our research and his research to understand Harari, he said, it is almost impossible to find some coherence in Harari's work or to subject it to deeper analysis. And if Harari himself said that in a world awash with irrelevant information, clarity is power, we are still far from explaining this phenomenon, the phenomenon of him rising. He says Harari offers no clarity, but declares clarity the ultimate goal. He's just hard to hold. I heard one time a scholar talk about following Noam Chomsky was like trying to hold mercury in your hand. It's just slippery. I feel like that way when you're talking about what he's arguing for and why he believes the things that he does. I'm not sure he knows. I think what he does is he writes what will be popular and what will advance his position, which makes him exactly what he condemns in Christianity, because he himself says that the storytellers and the curators of information are the people who accumulate the most power. They hold the power in any society. Well, what does he do? He weaves a great story, and he curates the information that he shares with you to serve his narrative. He is a master at what he condemns.
So before I ask you about how Christians should respond, especially if they meet someone who's a huge fan and feels like they've been influenced by his work, I want to go on to part 2 of the book. I'm glad that I didn't want to feel like I was being biased because I have a Christian worldview, but when I read the New York Times article on this book, which I felt like part 1 was an anti-religious screed, and I don't mean just against Christianity, but against religion generally. They kind of said, well, the first part, I don't even know what that was, but he gets into it in the second part, he's talking about AI. Does he see at all any benefit to AI, or just like the eventual demise of humanity before, I guess it's almost New Age, we ascend to being immortal or godlike? Does he see anything that can be redeemed in AI at all? Or does he see it all as manipulation by governments and groups for their own ends?
Yeah, he obviously has a positive view of AI and what it's capable of doing, and I think he has probably not probably. If you read some of the criticism from him by actual experts in this field that aren't working, I mean, he gets along very well with Zuckerberg. He gets along great with the guys over at Google and Alphabet. He gets along very well with that group who have a positive idea about how information is going to be able to shape the world around him. Although he's very critical of how Facebook curates the information that they're allowed shared on, because he puts at them, or at least the information that was shared, he lays at their feet what happened with Myanmar with the Rohingya, and there was a genocide, an attempt to destroy this group of people that was driven by false information that was spread largely through Facebook. And so he sees problems, but he also sees power. And power is important to him in his understanding of the world and the positive effects of it. He doesn't have, by the way, a problem with empires. He actually thinks empires are the most effective and longest running and most effective organization principle as far as the world goes. He said the problem that they've had before is the infallibility of information at the top, and then the ability to know what's going on around you and to be able to react to it. That AI could be a solution to that, and so some sort of democratic empire worldwide, losing nations, is something that sounds positive to him. But he does see risk. In Nexus, he talks particularly about risks like, what if AI prioritizes engagement over social cohesion? And what I mean by that is, what if the AI models, as they start to act on their own, prioritize the idea of the social media economy, which, by the way, is huge. The money that's out there is so. If you look at the largest industries out there, the social media economy worldwide is the largest industry. It dwarfs almost all other industries. It's so much money tied into it. So that's driven by engagement. That's driven by you reading things. Now, if AI realizes better than you what you like, and this is one of the things that he talks about, the idea of your phone monitors your response to things. Your computer monitors your response to things. And the better it gets at being able to monitor those things, and it gets very good. I mean, he does talk at one point about how Iran uses cameras in public to be able to watch women driving to see if they've taken their burqa off in their cars. And if they do, they get punished. So they're turning this observational equipment into the cars of people driving, so that if they see a woman that got into her car but is still in public and she has taken her burqa off for comfort, then she can be found and punished for what she did. As he says, these computers get better. They can read your temperature, your emotional response, the dilation of your pupils. They can see what you enjoy looking at, even if you don't want to admit it to yourself. And the problem is that what drives most people on the internet is most often emotion. And so if it prioritizes engagement to drive the social media economy versus social cohesion, then it will start to put people into information bubbles where they're just constantly feeding them the information that keeps them looking online, which is what we see today. And the more you see what will keep you online, it doesn't matter if it's true, the subject matter is to keep you going, the more likely you are to have factions, tribalism. And the worst part about it is, and I think we see this when you see polling. I remember seeing polling years ago where they asked people who identify themselves as liberal, progressive, or Democrat in particular sections, do you have any conservative friends? And they would say no. They asked a bunch of people who worked in journalism in New York, do you have any pro-life friends? Anybody that you associate on a daily basis would identify themselves as pro-life. And these people said no. And he said, this is an increasing problem because as we start to socialize more and more through these mechanisms, if AI is driving us towards engagement rather than this concept of society, then what's going to happen is you won't even know what the people who disagree with you believe. You'll just be taught to hate them or to fear them. And that's a danger. And I think he's right there. Now, again, he's right oftentimes. His critics say when he's right, he's just repeating other people's stuff, right? So that's a true thing that I've read that multiple places elsewhere, and he hasn't introduced that idea. But it is interesting that he talks about the need for us to be very careful about how we craft AI, so that when AI begins to make its own decisions, that it will make decisions that will serve humanity and not money, let's say, or whatever, a basic programming to drive engagement or something like that. So yeah, he sees positives and he sees things that it can, but in this again, he's no different than anyone else. If you read one of my favorite books out there is Nick Bostrom's book in Superintelligence, where he talks about the coming superintelligence. He talks less about AI than intelligence, but it's the same thing, right? And what Bostrom says is at that time that he wrote that, 30% of the people that were working on this believed it was going to be the answer to all of humanity's problems, or a third of people thought it was going to be the answer to all of humanity's problems. A third of the people thought it was going to be an extinction level event. And then a third of them just had no idea where we were going with all of this AI stuff, what was going to ultimately happen. And I think as he has good points. Those good points are points that have existed for a long time. He even borrows from Bostrom at one point without mentioning Bostrom. As he borrows from him, as he starts to use a couple of his illustrations where he talks about things as far as AI and the growth and the use, the dangers, the payoffs that could be there. But there he's right, but almost trivially so, because he's just repeating things that have already been said by others.
So finally, what's a good way for Christians to engage with someone like Yuval Noah Harari, who's this public intellectual, and he's captivated a global audience, and he's got these grand narratives that we talked about based on humanity. And at the same time, I think maybe some readers who, don't normally spend a lot of time like, oh, there's no footnotes. How is this referenced? Or what about this phrase or that phrase? How can we get them to engage in a discussion about some of the things that he's saying and maybe his methodology, and basically how we can give a Christian answer to, why Christianity is true? I mean, he specifically, very intentionally refers to religion every time he says it. He prefaces it with myths.
Myth every time.
Every time.
Yeah,
And
I
that would
think
be
that
all across the board. I mean, Buddhism, Hinduism, Christianity, it's all of
yep,
all of that.
every time. And he shared, other than Buddhism, which he is very, I mean, he is effectively, I think he's admitted on some level or another, he is a practicing Buddhist. I mean, the meditation that he practices is And he did. And I said he mentioned, I think, 4 paragraphs where he talked about the rise of monotheism, Judaism, and Christianity and the way that it changed the world. 4 paragraphs. I think he spent 5 pages later in that same book talking about how Buddhism is great. And so, and he tried to do it as if he were objectively talking about it. So we are talking about, like anyone else, somebody who's driven by their own personal interests. Um, I think, first of all, I think Christians need to have a dispassionate skepticism about a lot of what they're going to be seeing coming out in the world. And what I mean by dispassionate skepticism, I think that it would be the wrong thing to do is have a knee jerk, angry reaction to every time somebody says Christianity is not true, because we should expect people to say Christianity is not true. I mean, the rejection of Christianity is something that we've seen since its advent, and we are told through Scripture that we're not to expect the world to embrace Christianity. That would be weird. That the narrow is the gate, and that the demands of Christianity on you that require humility, recognition that you are on the wrong path, embracing this new life through Christ, losing yourself in this sense of recognizing that all of your own wishes and desires must now be subordinate to loving the Lord your God and loving your neighbor as yourself. That your life and your days and the things that you do are no longer yours, but belong to a Lord has the capacity to call you at any moment into either blessing or discomfort. It's a hard message for a world, and you have somebody like this sitting around saying, you are accidental meat machines, but we're on the verge of being able to turn you into gods. I can understand why that would be an exciting thing for somebody to hear. So I think the proper response when I say a dispassionate skepticism is know why you believe what you believe first. You mentioned apologetics. I have a very personal relationship with God that is driven by prayer and Bible study in the morning and talking about Him and seeing Him move within my life and the life of people around me. But just like everybody else, I am prone to moments of weakness and doubt. And in those moments of weakness and doubt, it's not always easy for me to turn my heart to where my heart should go because my heart is broken. But my mind can see truth that maybe my heart can't feel. And that's where apologetics, I think, is a great weed clearer. And so understanding why we believe what we believe beyond the personal reasons that I'm a Christian that go into why Christianity above others. So I think that began, and there, Greg Kokel from Stand to Reason wrote a great book called Tactics where he talks about how to discuss things. And I think the 3 questions that he says that people should ask when they're in a discussion with somebody else are very helpful, even our self-evaluation. What do you mean by that is the first question. Look for definitions, understand the clarity with as much clarity as possible, what kind of claim is being made. Um, how did you come to that conclusion being the second one? How did you come to believe these things about human beings? Yuval Noah Harari doesn't give a lot of specifics about how he came to believe these things about human beings. He doesn't give any explanation for why he rejects a lot of the things that he rejects. He just starts from the belief that all of these things are fictions, and then he beats it like a hammer for 4 books and now in children's books and every talk that he's ever, right? And he just hammers it, bam, bam, constantly. But he doesn't argue for it. And we need to look for where people argue for things and to see if there's a reasonable expectation for why they believe. And then finally, have you considered the consequences for your view? And I think here you see a fatal flaw for Harari's approach. You mentioned earlier, I mentioned earlier, but we both, if you read him, you will see him contradicting himself all the time. We can't know truth, but certainly what he says is true, right?
Oh, I
There
kept
was
thinking about that. You keep saying truth, and then who's that according to? What is the one truth standard that everybody in all
correct.
cultures will live by? Is that you? I mean, because that's kind of what it came across that way. I don't know that he meant to, but he never defined what is the ultimate thing that we can all agree on so that we orient ourselves to that. He did never.
Correct. Yeah. How do you know? How do you know what you're and why? If you're a determined, one of the things that drives me crazy about reading people who start to push this very strong sense of determinism, and by determinism you mean somebody who believes that you are not making decisions. They believe that every action that you take is the result of a biological and environmental series of events that happen. That the idea that you're making decisions is an illusion. Well, there's 2. Obviously, number one, I remember Greg Kokel one time, I'm mentioning him again from Stand to Reason, where he asked somebody if the illusion If it's an illusion, who is the illusion meant to fool? Right? It's deceiving someone. There has to be a person in there that's observing the illusion. If it's all an illusion, there is still a being that's being deceived, and that's you. They're trying to say that there is no you in there. There's just a meat machine that's going through a series of events. The other thing is, he claims to have studied, talked, and to all of these people to become an authority on these things, to be able to write about these things. But if he's a determinist, why would I believe what he's saying versus what anybody else is saying? Because his views are no more a product of free will than anybody else's. He doesn't believe free will exists. And I remember one time talking to a young lady in San Francisco, and she came up to me and she told me, I'm a determinist. I said, well, how did you become a determinist? And she said, I don't understand the question. I said, okay, and I listed off some of the determinists that I knew of. And I said, did you read their books or did you read articles by them? Think things through and then decide that their view probably was the best view of the world. It probably made the most sense of the life as you experience it. And she said, yes. And I said, so you decided after reading all of these things to become a determinist? And she said, yes, absolutely. So, well, young lady, I'm going to ask you one more time. And I want you to try to track with me. You believe that you are a determinist, which means you don't believe in the existence of free will, and you don't believe that we make decisions, and you believe that every physical action that we take is the outcome of some event that is both driven by our genetics and the environmental pressures that happened. And there is nothing that anybody is deciding to do. Is that correct? And she said, yes. And I said, and you decided that was true after having read Determinist and thinking that was a good view. And she walked away. She said, I don't have time for this, and left. But that's the same thing, right? If he's arguing for this strong determinist, this idea that we're these meat machines, that we're not individuals, we're not persons, at the same time, and there's no truth. And at the same time, I'm expected to accept that his arguments are true and that they have been formed through the determination and decision making of this scholar who holds information that I don't have and is somehow this sage or prophet for the world around us. It's just self-defeating nonsense and arguments one after another, but it's a great story. He is a great storyteller.
The other thing that, like you were saying, in his worldview, just saying that this is we're just all walking around in our meat locker skins, is that he specifically says in chapter 5 that the quote, the right to life is a basic human right that should never be violated. And so that is so fascinating to me because he never actually defines what life is. So when he says the right to life is a basic human right, so he's talking about human lives, he doesn't even explain what that is. So I don't know where he stands on that whole issue, because it's really fascinating, because he is against certain humans and for other humans. So it's very hard to know what he even means by this as a basic human right.
And he thinks humanism is a religion, but not Buddhism. I mean, he thinks capitalism is a religion. So he has this weird approach. And the funny thing for him about being as insulting as he is, at one point he says the Catholic Church and the Marxist Society, lumps both of them together. They both eschew the idea of correction, which is so monstrously unfair. If you look, I mean, if you have criticisms of the Catholic Church, it cannot be that they don't interact with the world around them on a scholarly level. They write articles, they publish articles, they put them out there for review. They're out there engaging the world. You have people like Robert George, Christopher Kaiser, Francis Beckwith, Maureen Kondik. I mean, all these people out there, they're engaging the world all the time, making arguments, listening to the other side, trying to find truth. And in addition to that, if the Catholic Church is trying to verify a miracle in their mind, they bring in skeptical doctors and medical doctors to evaluate it to see if there is any possibility that anything can be explained in any way outside of miraculous intervention on God's behalf. We're talking about a group of people that have worked very hard to look for, but he will point to very specific things and say, well, they're not self-correcting there. At the exact same time as he's leveling that charge in other people, he is terrible about taking responsibility for when he's been caught saying something that's not right. He just acts like it didn't happen. He goes back and he has re-edited things or changed things or just moved on and started arguing for something entirely different in the next book, where he changes the way he was arguing from the last book with not any recognition that this is a different thing that he's arguing. So he doesn't appear to be somebody who welcomes a lot of correction himself, as he looks at the rest of the world and says certain people aren't correcting themselves. I agree with what what Meglioli said, in the sense that the more you read him, the more difficult it becomes to give deep analysis to what he's saying. because it's not exactly clear what he's saying. Outside of the fact, what is very clear is that I think he is demonstration that a central part of his argument is true. That storytellers, great storytellers, hold a lot of power in our culture. And he is a great storyteller. He's unreliable on the facts. He's not reflective. He's not open and honest about certain things that he believes, but he is a fantastic storyteller, particularly Sapiens. And it was a story that captivated the world and gave him a lot of power. I think a lot like somebody like Orson Welles that spent the rest of his life trying to live up to Citizen Kane. I think at this point, if you watch his career, I think Yuval Noah Harari is going to spend the rest of his life trying to live up to Sapiens and failing to do so because it was such a huge thing that it'll be difficult for him to ever repeat that. But the love that he gets from certain people in certain industries and the speaking fees that he gets, I think he's going to be just fine.
Well, he is a very fascinating read for sure, but also I would say probably one of the most challenging, only in that I could never get a hold of a true, clear thesis as I read the book, because there were so many different things that were said out there. Well, finally, on a much lighter note, it's fall, and sometimes I ask guests about these. In the United States, we have these national days for every single day of the year. So coming up, we have National Donut Day. So what's your favorite donut?
Oh my gosh, I love donuts. I didn't know National Donut Day was a thing. We have a national day for everything now.
There is.
It's crazy. So I don't even know if some people will qualify as a donut, but at Dunkin' Donuts, I guess it's just Dunkin' now. At Dunkin', they have a chocolate cream filled donut. And I have loved that my entire life. And if somebody says they're going to Dunkin', the first thing they know if they're going for me is they need to get 2 chocolate cream filled donuts, because I'll tell them I only want 1, but I do really want 2. And then after that, it would be or tied, one of those two, at the right time when I'm in the mood and I'm feeling like I can afford to do it as far as for my physical health. A hot Krispy Kreme donut is just heaven. It is dangerous because I can eat a dozen by myself because they just melt in your mouth. But a hot Krispy Kreme donut is just heaven.
Coming off the conveyor belt, right?
Correct.
Krispy Kreme.
Yeah, if you're standing there, if you go inside, you can get them to put that spear as soon as it comes through the glaze fountain, right? It goes under the glaze waterfall and comes out, and they will spear it, put it on a plate, and hand it to you if you're right there. And it is hot. Oh my gosh, it is so good, though.
Well, thanks, Jay, for being a guest again on the Postmodern Realities podcast.
Oh, thank you for having me on.
You've been listening to episode 469 of the Postmodern Realities podcast from the Christian Research Journal. Today's guest was Jay Watts. He's written an online exclusive feature article for the Christian Research Journal. His article is called The Incredulity of Yuval Noah Harari, Evaluating the World's Foremost Big Story Historian, and you can read it for free at equip.org. You won't want to miss out on subscribing to the other podcasts from the Christian Research Institute. We have the Bible Answer Man podcast, which is published Monday through Friday with the best of the week on Saturday. It's hosted by CRI President Hank Hanegraaff and is available wherever you get your favorite podcasts. In addition, Hank has a podcast called Hank Unplugged. Hank takes you out of the studio and into his study to engage in free-flowing, essential Christian conversations on critical issues with some of the most interesting, informative, and inspirational people on the planet. And you won't want to miss out on the brand new podcast from the Christian Research Journal. Christian Research Journal Reads presents audio versions of Christian Research Journal articles. It was a print incarnation of almost 45 years. It's now on the web, as you know, with new articles every single week. So you won't want to miss these audio articles of some of our most popular and most accessed articles on our website, equip.org.